Benvinguts, benvingudes. Abans que res, m'agradaria agrair als organitzadors de la jornada el que m'hagin convidat per participar en ella i m'hagin encomanat la tasca de presentar la primera taula d'avui, que porta com a títol Com l'addicció segresta el cervell social. Per mi és un plaer presentar a un dels ponents, el doctor Antonio Verdejo García. Ell és doctor en Psicologia per la Universitat de Granada i ha realitzat la seva formació en investigació en diferents universitats internacionals, a la d'Iowa i a la Johns Hopkins d'Estats Units i també a Cambridge, al Regne Unit. El 2007 va estar també aquí a Barcelona en una plaça de recerca postdoctoral a l'Institut de Neurosciences de l'IMIM, a l'Hospital del Mar, i el 2012 va ser reclutat per la Universitat de Monash per dirigir un programa d'investigació translacional que relaciona els perfils cognitius amb els resultats del tractament de l'addicció. El laboratori que ell dirigeix té com a objectiu principal el trasllat de les troballes de la neurociència cognitiva al servei del tractament de l'addicció i de l'obesitat. El seu currículum és molt extens. Segur que hauran llegit més d'alguns dels seus articles sobre l'obesitat, sobre les addiccions i sobre la presa de decisions. Sense extendre'm més, voldria doncs donar pas al doctor Verdejo García.
Okay, so I'm going to try to put you in the same kind of situation, the same kind of scenario that we use to measure social cognition in our clients, in our patients. Imagine that you are on a cruise ship when there is a fire on board and the ship must be abandoned. The lifeboats are carrying too many people and the ocean starts to get rough and the boat begins to fill with water. On board, there is an injured man that will probably not make it, probably not survive. And therefore, if you throw this man overboard, he will certainly die, but the boat will stay safe and the others may survive. If you don't do so, the boat will probably sink and all of the people in the boat will die. So what would you do? Would you throw the man overboard? Or would you say, no, I wouldn't do it? So this is the situation. This is the kind of moral dilemma that we use to assess social cognition, social decision making in people with alcohol addiction and with substance addiction. So this is a kind of written presentation that we used in the first experiment that I'm going to present. So this is work that was conducted by one of my PhD students, Martina Carmona, and basically the experimental manipulation was like that. We did a written presentation of the dilemma, and that was the first phase. Then we left people to think about it and to give us a response, so whether they would do it or they wouldn't do it. So basically they had to tell us yes or no. And when they say yes, we label that response as the utilitarian response. And it's called utilitarian because it's more beneficial for everybody. So it's for the benefit of many. You have to kill someone, that's true, but it's for the benefit of much more people. So you save a number of people through that. The other option is the deontological choice or the deontological response, in which you say, well, I'm aware that I could save a lot of people, but I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't make that. So people basically have to decide if they do that or don't do that. And another thing that we did while they were thinking about it, while they were considering the two options, was recording their physiological response. We were monitoring their heart rate to see what was the emotional reactivity during the presentation and during the consideration of the dilemma. And in the end, we asked them how difficult it was for them to make the decision to say yes or to say no. So this is what we did in this study was in a sample of alcohol-dependent patients in comparison to non-alcohol using controls. And this is what we found. I guess the two interesting things in the plot that you have here on the top, you can see the proportion of yes, so the proportion of utilitarian choices. And these are different types of dilemmas, but probably these are the most interesting ones, which are the ones that are most similar to the one that I showed you about throwing the injured man overboard. And what we found is that the proportion of utilitarian choices is considerably higher in the alcohol-dependent group compared to the control group. So the alcohol-dependent clients were much more likely to throw the man overboard than the controls. And the second thing that we were interested in is, well, how difficult was that decision for you? And this is what you can see in the plot at the bottom. And it was interesting because not only they made more utilitarian choices, but they also found that those choices were easier to make. So for them, it was easier to decide to throw the man overboard. So what is this? That is mean that the people with alcohol dependence don't have a morality or something like that? Well, that's exactly what we were trying to not show. We were trying to explain this behavior from a cognitive affective point of view and from a neurobiological point of view. So the other thing that we did, as I told you before, is measuring what was the physiological response during the time that they were considering their choice, when they were considering whether to say yes or to say no. And I have to explain at this point that we had two different types of dilemmas, which is important to distinguish. We have some dilemmas in which there is a personal involvement of the person that is deciding, and some other dilemmas which are a little bit more impersonal. And I'm just going to explain the difference between the two with this example, which is the train dilemma. So you probably have heard about this train dilemma before. Basically, this train is out of control. So if you don't do anything, what's going to happen is that the train is going to go in this direction and it's going to kill these 5 people. So in the impersonal version of the dilemma, you, the person who is deciding about the dilemma, is in a remote place, in a control room, and you have the opportunity to use a switch, just activate a switch, and by activating the switch, you basically divert the train into the other rail, and therefore, rather than going in this direction, it will go in this direction, and it would only kill 1 person. But the thing is that the situation is relatively comfortable. You're in a secret room, in an anonymous place, and you just have to activate a switch and you will change the fate of these people. So it's a relatively impersonal version of the dilemma. The personal version of the dilemma is that, by chance, you have a person here who is trying to cross the rail, and what you have the opportunity to do is pushing this person into the rail, and then you are going to kill this person, but apparently it's a very big person and you can stop the train with that person, and therefore you have the same outcome. So you're going to kill 1 person, you're going to save 5, but probably in hearing this dilemma you are feeling more things than when you are in the anonymous room in which you just have to operate a switch. So this is the thing that we wanted to distinguish. We wanted to distinguish the psychophysiological reactivity to the personal dilemmas versus the impersonal dilemmas. And for that, we were monitoring the heart rate reactivity during the consideration of the dilemmas. And this is what we found. This is the critical decision phase, and this is the heart rate during that decision phase. And here you see the control group, and here you see the alcohol-dependent group. And you can see that whereas the control group very clearly distinguishes between the personal and the impersonal dilemmas, and develops a stronger heart rate reactivity to the personal dilemmas versus the impersonal dilemmas. When you move to the alcohol-dependent group, they're basically on top of each other, meaning that, let's say, their body doesn't discriminate between the personal situation and the impersonal situation. Their heart rate is very similar when considering the personal versus the impersonal situation. So that was exactly what we were looking for, because we were doing this experiment in the framework of the somatic marker theory that probably Antoine will talk a little bit more in depth a little bit later. But basically what the theory proposes is that in these situations in which you have to make a complex decision, that complex decision is going to be guided by affective markers. And if these affective markers are working properly, they're going to guide your decision to make the thing that is more advantageous in the long term. But in this case, in the social scenarios, what we saw is that the alcohol-dependent group was not generating these affective markers properly, and that was biasing their decisions in one certain way. So it's not that they are immoral, it's that they have a cognitive affective deficit that bias their decision making in a certain way. So we were interested in knowing what were the brain correlates, the brain underpinnings of that type of decision-making process. And then what we did was an fMRI study. So we did basically the same dilemmas, but we put people inside the scanner and analyzed what was the activity of the brain while people were considering these different type of dilemmas. Moral dilemmas versus non-moral dilemmas, in which you have to make a trivial decision. And this was a very costly study. It was very difficult to do. We were doing it in a detox facility with cocaine-dependent individuals monitored for abstinence during the development of the study. And I always make the joke that I think it's the only paper that I have published that have more authors than participants. I think we are more people here than the number of participants that we had in the scanner. And the reason is that it was very difficult to recruit them, and we had very strict selection criteria to make sure that they were only cocaine dependent, so they didn't have any other dependence to other substances or any other psychiatric disorder, and they had been abstinent for the time that we needed them to be abstinent. So quite similar to the designs that Boris was presenting before. And we presented them with these cartoons that were designed by the group of Jesus Pujol in the Hospital del Mar. And we were presenting this type of moral dilemma versus a non-moral dilemma, which is whether this person is gonna hit this shoot or not. And this is what we found. Here you can see the patterns of bold activation in the control group at the threshold level that we established. And this is the pattern of activation that we found in the cocaine-dependent group. And probably the most interesting thing is here, which is the contrast. So here at the bottom, you can see the brain regions that were more activated in the control group than in the cocaine group. And it was very interesting and very exciting for us. And these analyses were done by Oren Contreras. I don't know if he's in the audience. He was yesterday in one of the workshops. We were very excited to find that the regions that were less activated in the cocaine users were the regions, part of the regions that Boris was identifying before as part of the social cognition network, very prominently in the anterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, but also in the insula and also in the brainstem in the paracaudictal gray, which is an area which is very important in the instantiation of emotions. Oren also did some analysis in terms of resting state functional connectivity to see if these regions that were less activated in the cocaine users in response to the dilemma were also poorly connected in the brain. And we also found interesting things, like for example, two of the regions that we had found to be underactivated were also poorly connected. The connectivity between the PAG and the insula was decreased in resting state, meaning that part of the social network is altered at the level of resting state without any symptom provocation or any cognitive stimulation. All right, so that's kind of the first part and the first type of task that I wanted to show you. The second part is going to be a little bit different because I'm going to show you a different task, which is called the ultimatum game. It's a social interaction task, quite similar to the dictator game that Boris was presenting before. And the interest that we had in this study was slightly different to the previous ones. In this case, we were interested in examining what are the social cognitive deficits associated with the comorbidity between cocaine dependence and personality disorders. One of the main psychiatric disorders in drug addiction clients, and specifically in cocaine addiction clients, is personality disorders. And one of the main problems that these clients have are social interaction problems. And that is why many clinicians don't want to work with people with borderline personality disorder, right? Like they try to avoid them because they are very problematic. They have a lot of social interaction issues. So we were interested in what are the social cognitive deficits associated with this comorbidity. So to do this study, we used this version of the ultimatum game. We could probably call it the Barcelona ultimatum game because I don't know if you recognize this person here. He's Carla Soriano, who is one of my most beloved colleagues here. And but don't get distracted by him at the moment. I'm just going to explain you how the game works. It's an interactive game in which there is another player that is playing with you. In this case, Carlos is playing with you. And the thing is that Carlos has a lot of money, you know that. Well, I don't know if you know, but he has. And so he had a lot of money, and the only thing is that we asked him to share that money with our participants. So, for example, in this case, we knew that he had 24 euros, but he had to share those 24 euros with our participants. And he can make different type of offers. He can make fair offers, which would be, for example, just like giving 50% of the money. I have 24, I can give you 12. Or he can make unfair offers, like this one. Like our participant knew that Carles had 24 euros, but Carles only wanted to give him 6 euros, which is quite unfair, right? So when like the first people who started to play with these games were people from economists. And for them, the big discovery was that people tend to reject some of these offers. The offers work this way, like if you're the participant, we tell you, well, if you accept the offer, the money is distributed in the way that we specify. So you get 6 euros and the other person keeps the rest. But if you say no, you don't get the money and the other guy don't get the money. So you have the opportunity, if you think that the offer is unfair, to say, oh, this guy is a real prick. I want to punish him and I'm going to reject the offer. So the big discovery for economists was to realize that people would reject these offers, which is against rationality in economy, isn't it? Because you always want to get money, and more money, better. But psychologists and neuropsychologists know that the brain works in a slightly different way. So what happens is that people tend to reject offers when they perceive that they are unfair. And actually, if you look at the brain, when people is processing the unfair offers, you can see a lot of activation in emotional regions, in regions that are involved in emotional processing. So that is the kind of context that we were interested in examining in these clients. And as I told you, we had a sample of people with cocaine dependence and personality disorders. And the prevalence of personality disorders have been estimated in between 40 and 70% among cocaine-dependent users, which is a really useless statistic, because if it's between 40 and 70, what it is? I mean, like, and the reason is because it's very difficult to diagnose personality disorders, so that's why prevalence estimates fluctuate so much. But we found that around 42% of our sample had some type of personality disorder. And the most prevalent ones were these two, the ones from cluster B, which include the antisocial personality disorder that Boris was talking about before, and borderline personality disorder. And the main characteristics of these disorders are that they are very dramatic, very emotional, and very erratic, and have a lot of problems with affective regulation. And then we had as well a number of clients from cluster C personality disorders that are more in the anxious spectrum. So they are anxious, fearful, avoidant. So for example, the obsessive compulsive disorder, the personality disorder, would be one example of the cluster C. So we were interested in examining what happens when, on top of cocaine dependence, you have a personality disorder in terms of social cognition and brain activity related to social cognition. So these are the behavioral results. So these are in the y-axis, you can see the percentage of offers that people chose to accept. And you can see, if you just look at the control group, you can see how people accept most of the fair offers. So when 50% of the money is offered, people mostly accept them. And you can see that when the offers are unfair or very unfair, people tend to reject more offers. And here you can see the cocaine users with cluster B problems and cluster C problems. So in the case of cluster B, the thing is that they are pretty normative in the type of choices that they make. You can see that they can behave very similarly to controls. They basically have the same type of modulation. So they accept most of the fair offers, and then they reject most of the unfair and very unfair offers. But it was interesting to find the pattern in cluster C, the people that is more anxious, more avoidant, because they had an interesting pattern. They had the tendency to accept more unfair offers, probably in an attempt to avoid conflict. I don't want any conflict with Carles. We know that he's a very dangerous man, and we don't want any issues with him. So they accepted more offers even though they were unfair. And on the other hand, and maybe in an effort to compensate, they also rejected a number of fair offers. So we had kind of a diversion of the typical pattern of social interaction, specifically in this cluster. Then when we analyzed the imaging data, we have done a number of different mathematical models to try to disentangle what are the main brain regions linked to the social decision making involved in the ultimatum game. And just to give you the long story short, basically there are two regions that are quite relevant for this type of decisions. One is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is quite relevant in social cognition and also in general in the processing of conflictive information, conflict resolution. And the other one is the insula, which is very important in the processing of unfairness. So what we found is that people with cocaine dependence and personality disorders had decreased activation, less activation of both the insula and the anterior cingulate when they were doing this type of decisions, when they were making social cognitive decisions in this interactive game. On top of that, we also found that they had some hyperactivation, some increased activations in some of the regions of the prefrontal cortex, specifically in the superior frontal gyrus and in the lateral prefrontal cortex. And it seems like they need these regions to compensate somehow for the underactivation of the core network of the ultimatum game. We found as well that the pattern of brain activation was linked to how well they could recognize emotions in the faces of others. And that gave us as well a little bit more of security, confidence in the fact that the brain patterns were actually linked to part of their social behavior. And that is quite relevant because, as Boris was saying before, like one of the key problems that we see in addiction clients is that they get a significant deterioration of their social network. So that was an interesting finding as well. So that's it. As the conclusions, I guess the main one is that substance addiction seems to be the case for alcohol and for cocaine. So it seems to be kind of generalized to different substances, or at least these ones, is linked to blunted activation of affective markers that generally lead to utilitarian decision making. These alterations are linked to diminished activation in brain regions that are very important for social cognition. So let's say the core network of the social brain, including the anterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex, the insula, and some regions in the brainstem that are quite important for instantiation of emotion. These findings are generally consistent with our theoretical framework, with the idea that emotions are quite relevant for complex decision making and specifically quite relevant for social decision making. So the bottom line is that if you want to make good social decisions, you need adaptive affective markers. You need to generate and perceive affective markers that help you to frame these complex social decision making. In my slides, I had that causation is unresolved, but actually Boris resolved this already, and that was quite cool to know what part of this is pre-existent and what part of this is linked to, for example, cocaine dependence. So I think that was a very nice thing that probably makes my slide already dated. So thank you for that. So that was it. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and hope that you enjoyed. We'll keep the questions for after the break so that you can have a good coffee now. Thank you.